The frost came to Caldmere in the deep of February that year, and it did not leave. It lay white and unbroken over the long lawns and the walled garden and the black hedges, over the stilled fountain and the shrouded roses, over everything that had been green in summer and was silent now. To look at it in the gray light before dawn was to believe the whole living world had stopped. Nothing moved. Nothing grew. Any stranger passing the gates would have said, and said with confidence, that here was a place where the year had ended, and nothing more would come of it. But a garden in a hard winter keeps its secret better than any person can. Beneath the frozen crust, where no cold could reach it, the work of the spring had already begun. The bulbs were swelling blind in the dark. The roots were drinking. Under the ice, 1,000 small living things were quietly becoming what they would be. Whether a soul believed in them or not, the stillness was a lie. The death was a lie. Under the white and under the silence, the whole future of the garden was already alive and only waiting. It was through that frost-bound garden, in the last dark hour before the light, that the Duchess of Caldmere walked out for the final time. She went quietly, in a plain traveling cloak, carrying one small bag and one thing more that no one in the house could see. She did not look back at the lit windows. She carried away with her, unseen beneath her heart, the one thing in the world her husband had ever truly longed for, and she had decided, in the cold of that same night, that he would never know she had taken it. It had happened the evening before, in the long room where Alaric Stern, the Duke of Caldmere, kept his books and his ledgers and the greater part of his silences. He had asked her to come to him after the household had gone up, and she had come, because in 2 years of marriage she had never once refused him anything, and because she still, heaven help her, hoped. She found him standing at the cold end of the room, away from the fire, with a bundle of papers on the table before him. He did not ask her to sit. He looked at her a long moment with the gray eyes that had first drawn her to him, and that had grown harder and further off with every month of their marriage, and she saw that something in him had closed for good. "There are letters," he said. His voice was very quiet and very even. That was the thing she would remember after, that he never once raised it. "Letters in your hand, letters that go back to before our marriage and did not stop at it. I have read them. I would sooner have died than read them, and I have read every one." He told her then what the letters said, that she had never loved him, that she had taken his name and his fortune with her eyes open and her heart already spent on another, a man she had known before, a man she had gone on writing to in secret, a man to whom money had passed out of the Caldmere accounts by her arranging. He laid it before her in that flat, quiet, terrible voice, one charge after another, and every word of it was false, and every word of it was written in a hand so near to her own that she understood in a rush of cold exactly how well it had been done, and by someone who wished her wholly destroyed. "That is not my hand," she said. "I never wrote them. Alaric, I have never in my life written to any man but you. Whoever made these made them to ruin me. You must see it. You, above all people, must see it." "I see a great deal," he said. "I have seen it some while now and told myself I was a fool to see it. I have finished being a fool." She might have wept. She might have crossed to him and taken his cold hands and begged him to believe her, and some women would have, and there would have been no shame in it. But Emmeline Stern had married this man loving him, and had spent 2 years learning that her love frightened him for reasons he would never name, and she found that she could not beg a man to believe a truth he had already resolved to refuse. Her pride was very nearly the last thing left to her. She kept it. She stood straight in the cold room and let him do the thing he had plainly settled on before ever she came through the door. "Say it then," she said. "Whatever it is you called me here to say, say it plainly." And he said it plainly. "This marriage is over." The Duke said, the words fell into the room and lay there. He did not take them back. He told her, still without lifting his voice, that a carriage would stand ready at first light, that she would want for nothing in the way of money, that papers would be drawn and the world told, whatever caused the least talk. He told her she need never look on him again. He said the whole of it with his eyes on the dark window, and not on her, as though he could not do the thing and watch her face at once. What she could not know, because he would not let it show, was that some part of the man was breaking even as he spoke, and that the coldness was not the absence of feeling, but the only wall he had ever found. That feeling could not throw down. She saw only the wall. She was meant to see only the wall. "Very well," she said, when she could trust her voice. "At first light." And she left him there, alone, with the lie he had chosen over her, and went up the great cold stair for the last time. She did not sleep. She sat at the window of the room that had been hers, and watched the frost brighten slowly across the glass, and she made the hardest reckoning of her life. For she carried a secret of her own, and the bitter comedy of it was that she had gone down to that room, meaning at last to tell him. She had been almost sure for a fortnight. That very morning she had become sure past all doubt. She was with child. After 2 years in which no child had come, in which she had watched her husband want one with a wordless hunger he believed he hid, in which she had seen him go still and strange near the tenant's children, and then turn away as though the wanting shamed him, she was carrying his heir at last. She had meant to tell him that night beside the fire. She had come down with the words ready in her mouth, and had found instead the papers on the table and the shut gray eyes and the end of everything. Now she sat in the dark and turned the knowledge over and over, and she saw that it changed nothing, or rather that it changed all things, and she must act as though it changed nothing. She could go down to him even now. She could take his hand and lay it against her and tell him, and she did not doubt for a moment what would follow. He longed for a child more than he longed for his own breath. He would keep her. Whatever he believed of her, he would keep her under his roof for the sake of the life she carried, and he would be, in his cold and careful way, glad of it. And she would pass the rest of her years as the woman a duke had kept for her womb and not for herself, watched and doubted, and never once believed, raising a child in a house where its mother was held a liar and a thief. She would take the one true and living thing there had ever been between them and let it become the chain that bound her to a man who had chosen a forgery over her word. She would not do it. She found, sitting there in the whitening dark, that she would rather be poor and free and believed by no one on earth than be kept for her child by the man she loved. If he could not want her without the child to make her of use, then he should not have her at all. And neither, she thought, with a fierceness that startled her, should he have the easy comfort of knowing the child was in the world. Let him keep his silence. She would keep hers. It was the one thing of his she meant to carry off, and the one thing she meant never to give back. There was a colder reason as well, and she made herself look straight at it. If it were ever known that the Duchess of Caldmere had gone away carrying the Caldmere heir, there was one man who would not rest easy at the news. Gervais Stern stood to come into everything his cousin held, if no child of Alaric's ever drew breath. Gervais, who was all warm smiles and open hands, whom every hostess in the county found so very pleasant, and whom she had twice caught watching her when he believed himself unseen, with a look that had sent her quietly to try the lock on her door. She knew only that a child unlooked for and unknown was a child that was safe, and a known one might not be. That settled the last of it. Before the light came, she did the small hard things that must be done. She dressed for traveling. She left upon the table the jewels that belonged to the family, and took only what had been her mother's. She wrote no letter, for there was nothing she might write that was not either a lie or a weapon, and she would leave him neither. And at the very last, already in the doorway, she turned back and took the one thing she had told herself she would not take. From the drawer where it lay, she lifted the small iron key to the door of the walled garden. It was the single place in all of Caldmere where her husband had ever let the wall in him come down, not in words, for he had few to spare, but in the cold, bright mornings of their first spring together, when he had worked at her side in the frozen beds, with his sleeves turned back and his hard face for once unguarded, the two of them, setting in things that would not flower for a year, saying almost nothing. It was the truest they had ever been to one another. She could not have said why she wanted the key, except that a woman, leaving everything, is allowed to carry off one foolish thing. And this was hers. Then Emmeline Stern went down through the sleeping house and out into the frost, and the great garden lay white and silent and seemingly dead on every side of her as she went, keeping its secret as she kept hers alive underneath where no eye could find it. The one thing the Duke of Codmere had longed for the whole of his life walked out through his gates in the grey hour before the dawn. He did not know, and she had decided that he never would. The carriage he had promised stood waiting in the courtyard at first light, precisely as he had said it would, the horses breathing smoke into the hard air and a silent groom at their heads. Emmeline had half thought she might feel something at the sight of it, some last pull toward the house at her back. She felt only the cold, and beneath the cold, a great flat calm, which she knew even then, for the calm that comes after a wound and before the pain of it has arrived. She let the carriage carry her, but not far and not in the way its driver supposed. She had him set her down at the coaching inn in the county town, and there she paid the man and thanked him and told him in a voice that did not shake that his grace need send no further. She stood in the inn yard and watched the Caldmere arms on the carriage door go back the way they had come until the frost swallowed them whole. Then she turned, a woman in a plain cloak with a plain bag, and took a place on the common stage under her mother's name, which was Selby, and which no soul in that country had any reason to know. It was the surest way to vanish, she had reasoned through the long night. A duchess might be traced by a ducal carriage from posting house to posting house across half of England. A tired young widow named Selby, one grey face among a dozen others on a public coach, would leave no trail at all. The journey was long, and it was hard, and it taught her at once the true size of the thing she had done. She had been 2 years a duchess, warm and carried and deferred to, and she had forgotten, if ever she had truly known what the world was for a woman alone, with little money and no name worth the speaking. The coach was cold, and it was crowded, and it threw her without mercy over the frozen ruts of the road. On the second morning the sickness took her, the sickness she had been warned to look for, and she bore it with her face turned to the window and her jaw set hard, and told the woman beside her it was nothing but the motion of the coach. She counted her money over twice a day, and made it stretch. She ate little and slept less and kept deep in the pocket of her cloak the small iron key, turning it and turning it with cold fingers as though it were a thing that might yet keep her warm. Once at a change of horses after dark, a rough man in the crowded taproom pressed too close and spoke to her with a familiar rudeness that no one had dared show her in the whole of her married life. She looked at him steadily until he thought better of it and moved away. But her heart was going hard when he had gone, and she understood a little more of the country she had walked out into. There was no wall about her now. There was no great name to stand between her and the rudeness of strangers. There was only herself and the child she did not yet show, and a key to a garden 4 counties behind her. She thought of Alaric more than she wished to, not of the cold man in the library with the papers before him, but of the other one, the one almost no one living had ever seen, who had knelt beside her in the black spring earth, with his sleeves turned back and shown her, without a single word for it, how to set a root so that it would take. She put the memory from her each time it came, the way one puts a hand back from a fire, and each time it came again. That was the cruelty of it. It would have been so much easier to leave a man she could bring herself to hate. She came to Netherby on the 4th day, as the light was going out of the sky, a small, hard village at the grey edge of the fens, the last cottages on the last road, the kind of place a person comes to when she wishes, above all things, not to be found. She climbed down from the carrier's cart that had brought her the final miles and stood in the rutted road with her bag and looked at the low huddle of roofs under the wide and darkening sky, and was more frightened and more free than she had ever been in the whole of her life. Somewhere among them was the one door in all the world she believed would open to her. She had not stood before it in 12 years. She went to find it. The door she sought belonged to a low cottage at the far end of the village, where the lane gave out into reeds and water and mist. The woman who opened it was old now and bent, and her hair gone white beneath her cap, but the eyes were the very same, and they knew Emmeline on the instant, 12 years and a whole duchy in between them notwithstanding. "Dorcas," Emmeline said, and found she could say nothing more at all. Dorcas had been her nurse in the years when her mother was dying, and then in the harder years after, and she had loved the motherless child of that quiet gentleman's house with a plain, fierce love that asked for nothing back. When Emmeline had married, she had done one thing quietly with the first of her new consequence. She had settled a small yearly sum on the old woman who had raised her, enough for a cottage and a fire and bread, and had told no one, least of all her husband, that she had done it. She had not thought, when she did it, that she was buying herself the one refuge she would ever need. She had only wanted Dorcas warm. The old woman took one long look at her, at the plain cloak and the shadowed face and the bag held in both hands, and she did not ask a single one of the questions another woman would have asked. She only stood back from her own doorway and said, "Come you in out of the cold, my lamb, before you catch your death on my step." And Emmeline went in, and the door closed behind her on the dark and the mist, and for the first time in 4 days, and in truth for far longer than that, she was somewhere that no one wished her any harm. There was a fire, small and red and living. There was a bowl of broth put into her hands before she had got her cloak off, and a low bed in the corner with a clean, coarse blanket. And none of it was grand, and all of it was given freely and without one word about a price. And it was that, in the end, and not the cold or the fear or the long road that broke her. She sat by the little fire in that poor warm room, and she wept as she had not let herself weep in the great cold house she had left, wept until there was nothing left in her, while the old woman sat close beside her and held her hand in 2 dry hands and said nothing, and let her. When she was quiet again, she told Dorcas the truth, or as much of it as the old woman needed, that the marriage was over, that her husband believed a thing of her that was not true, and could not be unbelieved. That she was with child, and that the child was the reason above all reasons that no one must ever learn where she had gone. Not who her husband was, not that a duke's heir slept under this low roof, and most of all, not any face or name that came out of Caldmere. She made the old woman understand that last part very plainly, though she did not say why, for she would not speak the name of Gervase Stern in that clean room. Dorcas heard the whole of it without once letting go of her hand. Then she said, "You'll be a widow then, to Netherby folk. A young widow named Selby, come out to the fen air for her health and her mourning, carrying her poor dead husband's child. There's no one here will pry at that, grief and a coming babe. Folk leave both of those be." She nodded slowly, settling the story in her mind as a woman settles a stitch. "And no one comes to Netherby, my lamb? That's the whole of what Netherby is for." In the days that followed, the old woman was as good as her word, and better. She put it about the few doors that mattered, that her young kinswoman had come to her, widowed and grieving and near her time. And Netherby, which had buried enough of its own to know what such a woman needed, gave back only rough kindness and a wide berth. Dorcas asked nothing of the years between. She taught the Duchess instead the things a Duchess had never had cause to learn: how to bank a fire, so it held till morning, how to mend by rushlight, how to make a little food go far enough. And she watched over her with a plain, unsleeping care, as though the 12 years and the great marriage had never come between them, as though Emmeline were still the small, motherless girl she had once carried on her hip through a colder house than this one. Emmeline held to that. In the days that came, she began carefully to believe she might truly disappear, that the fen and the mist and the plain false name might close over her like water over a dropped stone, and that her child might be born safe and unlooked for, and hers alone. She let herself begin to hope it, but Dorcas, banking the fire that first night while the younger woman slept at last, looked a long while into the coals with her old wise face, and said very softly to no one, "Secrets don't keep so well as you'd think, my lamb. Not the ones with a heartbeat in them. Those have a way of coming to be known. Before we go on, if this story has taken hold of you, and if you would not wish to miss the ones that follow, do take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Now let us go back to Caldmere, and to the man she left, standing in the cold." The Duke of Caldmere told himself, in the first gray days after she had gone, that he had done the only thing a man in his place could do, and that he was well rid of what he had lost, and that the great stillness now settling over his house was peace. He told himself this with the whole force of his considerable will, and did not believe it for a single hour. The house was wrong. That was the plain fact he could not argue down. It had been a cold house all his life, and he had thought himself long past minding it, and now with her gone out of it, it was cold in a new and emptied way, and he could not cross the gallery without his eye going to the places where she was not. He had not known, until he had driven her out of them, how many rooms in his own house had quietly become hers. He knew where the coldness in himself had come from. He had been a boy of 9 years old when his mother went. Not died, went. Left the house one bright morning in another man's carriage and did not come back, and left behind her a husband who never again spoke her name, and a small son who learned, in the long silence that followed, the single lesson his father had to teach. A stern shows nothing, a stern trusts nothing that can leave. A warm heart, his father had told him once and only once in a voice like a closing door, is the knife you hand another man and beg him to use. Alaric had taken the lesson to his bones and built his whole life upon it, and it had kept him safe, and it had kept him alone, and until a certain spring he had believed those to be one and the same thing. Then he had married a quiet gentleman's daughter, for reasons meant to be sensible and never were, and she had walked straight through his walls as though she could not see them, and one cold bright morning in the walled garden she had knelt in the dirt beside him and laughed, and he had felt the whole cold architecture of himself shift on its base. It had terrified him past telling. He had spent 2 years since half in love and half in dread of it, drawing back each time he drew near, punishing her a little for a power she did not know she held, because the wanting of her was the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to him, so that when the letters came, laid before him by a hand that grieved to bring such news, he had believed them. That was the thing he would have to live with. He had believed them almost gladly, in the deepest and most cowardly part of him, because they told him what his father had promised him long ago was true, that love was the knife, that the warm thing betrays you in the end, better to be right and cold than wrong and open. He had believed the letters because they let him stop being afraid of how much he loved his wife. There was one thing more, and it was the thing he could least bear to look at. He had wanted a child, not as other men in his position want one, for the name and the land, though the world would have understood that. He had wanted a child for a reason. He had never spoken to any living soul, and would have died before speaking. He had wanted, one time in his life, to stand in a warm room and give to a small frightened person every last thing that had been kept from him in the cold one. He had married half hoping for it, and never dared say so, and now he had sent away the one woman who might have given it to him, and the wanting sat in him like a stone. He should have burned the letters. Instead he kept them, and read them again on the third night, alone, and it was then that the wrongness first reached him, though he pushed it off. The hand was too like hers, too like and too steady, and here a turn of phrase she would never have used, and there a date that did not sit with where she had been, and a coldness all through them that did not belong to the woman who had wept over a dead tenant's children. He set them down as though they had grown hot in his fingers. He told himself, "A guilty woman writes coldly." He would not let himself think the other thought, the one that waited just behind the first, because to think it fully was to know he had taken the single warm living thing in his cold life and destroyed it with his own hands for nothing, and no man can think that and stay upright. So, he did not think it, not yet. It did not help that Gervais was so very kind about it all. His cousin had come the day after, grave and gentle and full of warm sorrow, pressing his hand, telling him he had done what any man of honor must, that the fault was all hers. Alaric had thanked him, and when his cousin had gone he had sat a long while frowning at the fire, for something in all that ready warmth had sat ill with him, though he could not have said what, and he was too wretched to hunt it. Near midnight he went up. He did not mean to go to the drawer. His feet took him. It was the drawer where a small iron key had lain for 2 years, the key to the door of the walled garden, and he did not know until his hand closed on empty wood why he had come. The key was gone. Of everything in that great house she might have taken and had every right to take. Of all the jewels and silver she had left cold on the table, she had taken one thing only, and it was that, the one place he had ever let her see him. She had taken the key to it and left him all the rest. He stood over the empty drawer a long time. Then he went down and out, alone, into the frozen dark of the garden, where the two of them had once knelt in the good black earth, and he stood among the shrouded beds under the hard stars, and understood far too late what he had thrown away. He did not know the half of it. He did not know that 4 counties off, in a poor warm room at the edge of the fens, the whole of what he had longed for his whole life lay sleeping under the same cold sky, alive and unlooked for, growing quietly toward him in the dark. Wunco. The frost broke in the 3rd week of March, all at once, in the way it does in a hard country. One morning the fen lay iron and white as it had lain since November, and the next there was water moving in the dikes and the smell of thawed earth on the wind, and within the fortnight the first green was pricking up through the black soil of the little plot behind the cottage. Emmeline stood at the low window and watched it come, the whole slow uncovering of the year, and laid her hand against the small, firm curve of herself that no cloak could altogether hide now, and understood that the two were the same thing. All that long white winter, under the frost, out of every sight, the life had been busy becoming itself, now it was showing. There was no more hiding a thing that was alive. She had thought, when she came to Netherby, that she had come there to disappear. She found as the spring came on that she had come there instead to be born a second time, and that the woman rising out of that hard, quiet season was one she had never been allowed to be. A duchess is a thing done to a woman by other people. She is dressed and placed and spoken for, and the whole art of her is to want nothing that is not first approved. Emmeline Selby, the young widow at the fen edge, was allowed to want things, and to do them with her own 2 hands, and to fail at them, and try again, and she discovered in herself, week by week, a strength she had carried all her life, and never once been permitted to use. She learned to dig the black soil and set seed in it, kneeling in the plot behind the cottage as she had once knelt in a walled garden 4 counties off. And if she wept, sometimes over the setting of a root, Dorcas had the grace to be busy elsewhere and to say nothing of it after. She learned to bake the coarse fen bread. She learned the names of the fen birds and the turn of the fen year. She grew brown and strong and sure, and the child grew with her, and she talked to it in the evenings by the little fire as though it could hear her, telling it in a low voice all the things she meant it to have that she herself had gone without. And with every week that passed, the child became more real to her, and less of fear, until she could not for the life of her remember how she had ever been frightened of it. This small, insistent companion that shared her days now and had begun, in the quiet, to feel less like a secret she was keeping, and more like the one true friend she had left in the world. There were hard days in it too, and she did not pretend otherwise even to herself. There were mornings when the sickness and the loneliness and the sheer animal fear of what was coming pressed down on her until she could scarcely rise, and nights when the wind came off the water like a living grief, and she lay awake and did the sums of her small money over and over and could not make them come right. But the fear did not master her as once it would have. She had learned a thing in that hard country that the soft country of her marriage had never taught her, which was that she could be afraid and go on anyway. That courage was not the absence of the fear, but the going on in spite of it, and that a woman who has once found this in herself is very difficult indeed to break. She went on. The mornings came and she rose to them and dug and baked and mended and waited and grew. Word of the gentle widow Selby spread a little, as such things will, further than she knew and further than was wise. It began on a wild wet night in April, when a laborer's wife, 2 cottages down, was brought to bed early and hard, and the fen midwife was away at the far end of the parish, and someone came running for the young widow because there was no one else. Emmeline had never, in her sheltered life, attended a birth. She went all the same because there was no one else, and she found in that low smoky room a calm and a competence she had not known were in her, and she held the frightened girl through the worst of it and spoke to her steadily, and did what plainly needed doing, and near dawn a living child cried out where there had very nearly been 2 deaths instead. The girl and the babe both lived, and the story of it went out from Netherby along the fen paths and the market roads, the story of the soft-spoken widow with the gentle hands who had come from nobody knew quite where and saved a mother and a child in the night. It was only a small story. It went only a little way. But a little way, in a country of long straight roads and few travelers, is further than a hunted woman can afford. Emmeline did not think of that. She had begun, against all her own hard warnings to herself, to be nearly happy. She had a roof and a fire and work for her hands and an old woman who loved her, and under her heart she carried the one wholly good thing her marriage had made, and she told herself that this was enough, that this was more than she had any right to, that she would ask the world for nothing further. She almost believed it. Only at night, sometimes, with the child turning in her in the fen wine at the window, she would find her hand had gone by itself to the pocket where the small iron key still lay, and she would hold it in the dark and think of a hard, gray-eyed man kneeling in the spring dirt with his sleeves turned back, that he had chosen a forgery over her word, and that she did not want him, and that she was done. And then she would put the key away and turn her face to the wall, and in the morning she would rise and dig her garden and be nearly happy again. It is a great deal to be nearly happy. She knew by then exactly how great a deal it was, and she guarded it, and she did not once let herself see how thin was the wall that kept it. 4 counties off, the Duke of Caldmere had stopped being able to lie to himself, and it was undoing him. It had begun with the dates. He had gone back to the letters a 4th time, and a 5th, hating them, unable to leave them, and the thing his mind had shied from on the 3rd night would no longer be shied from. One of the letters, the coldest of them, the one in which his wife was made to set out in her own supposed hand exactly how little she had ever felt for him, was dated in the September of the year before. And in that September, as any man might learn who cared to ask, the man to whom all the letters were addressed had been 14 months dead. Captain Merrick, the gallant of the forged correspondence, the lover Emmeline was said to have kept, had died of fever off a foreign coast a year and more before the tenderest of his letters was ever written to him. A living woman does not write to a dead man. A forger working from old gossip and not troubling over a date very easily makes her seem to. Once he had seen the one impossibility, he saw them all. He saw the too steady hand. He saw the turns of phrase that were his wife's, and the turns that were not the not ones laid over the real ones like a bad tracing over a good drawing. He saw that the whole edifice which had seemed when he was afraid to be a solid and terrible truth, was in fact a thing built by a person, with labor, on purpose, to make him do exactly what he had done. And he had done it. He had needed so little persuading. That was the part he could not get past, and it was the part that had nothing to do with the letters and everything to do with the boy of 9 years old in the cold house. He had been handed a lie that flattered his oldest wound, and he had snatched at it, and he had used it to destroy the one person who had ever got past his walls, and no impossibility of dates could give him that back. He did not sleep. He walked the house at night like a man looking for something he had mislaid, and the something was his wife, and she was not there, and it was he who had put her out. In the day, he was worse. For in the day he had to be the Duke of Caldmere, and the effort of it laid him open. His servants, who had feared him for years and never loved him, began without understanding why to be gentle with him, the way one is gentle with the very ill. Old Ansel, his lawyer, who had known him since he was that boy of 9, came down from London at his summons, and looked at his face and set down his papers and said, before ever a word of business, simply, "What have you done, my lord?" And the Duke of Caldmere, who did not confide in any living soul, told him all of it. It came out of him in the cold library in a low, steady voice that did not once break, which was somehow the worst of it, and when he had finished the old man was quiet a long while, and then he said, "Then we had better find out who made these letters, for someone did, and a man who would do this has a reason. And the reason is the thread that leads to the truth." They pulled the thread together through the wet, gray weeks of the spring, the old lawyer and the ruined Duke. It led, as such threads do, downward to a broken-down engraver named Pale, a clever man gone to drink and debt, who for years had made his living forging hands for anyone who could pay, and who was found at last in a back room in a low quarter of the county town, and who was very frightened. He had been paid, he said, and paid well, and given samples of the lady's hand to copy from an old talk about a dead captain to build upon, and told what the letters must be made to say. He had never met the lady, he had never asked why. A man in his trade did not ask why, but he remembered the gentleman who had paid him, for the gentleman had worn no name and given none, and had come cloaked and by night, and had all the same been unmistakably a gentleman, tall and easy and pleasant-spoken, with a way of smiling while he named a cruel thing that had made even Peel, who was not particular, uneasy in his skin. The Duke of Caldmere stood in that squalid room and listened to a drunkard describe his own cousin, and felt the last piece of it go into place with a click he seemed to hear in his very bones. He said nothing. He had, all his life, been a man who said nothing, but something had happened to his silence in those weeks. It had stopped being armor. It had become, instead, a held breath, an enormous gathering stillness, the silence of a man drawing back a bow. He paid Peel, and told the terrified engraver he would be wanted again, and had better be findable, and went out into the rain, and stood in it, and let it fall on him. He knew now, he knew the whole shape of it. His wife was innocent. He had known her innocent in his heart within 3 days, and let his pride sit on the knowing for months. And the man who had made him do it, the man who had watched him break the best thing in his life and had come the next day to press his hand and comfort him and tell him the fault was all hers, was his own blood, and was even now moving about the county wearing his warm and pleasant smile, waiting to come into everything a childless Duke would leave behind him. He must find her. That was the whole of it, and it rose in him. Now past the guilt and past the rage, a single driving need. He must find her, and stand before her, and tell her he knew, and let her do with him whatever she chose. He went home through the rain and began the search that same night, and within a day he had struck the first wall of it, which was that she had vanished as cleanly as a stone into a fen. The ducal carriage sent back from the county town. A trail that ended dead in the yard of a coaching inn. No duchess anywhere in England. He had built her, without knowing it. The perfect disappearance, by making her so wholly wretched that she had spent her last strength on being unfindable. He set every quiet resource he had to the hunt, and he did not yet know how little time he had, for he did not yet know that another man had begun, from the far side, to hunt her too. Gervais Stern had always understood his cousin far better than his cousin understood him, and it was the whole foundation of his life. He had understood, from boyhood, the exact shape of the wound in Alaric, and had filed the knowledge away as a careful man files a thing that may one day be of use. He had understood that a man taught by a cold father to expect betrayal would betray himself, given only a plausible push, and would then be too proud to look closely at the push. He had understood that the marriage was the one true danger to everything he had spent his life waiting for a beloved wife meant, in the end, a child, and a child meant that Gervais Stern, who stood next in blood to the whole of Coldmere and had ordered his entire existence around the coming into it, would inherit nothing but a cousin's civil contempt and a small allowance. He had watched the marriage warm. He had seen at a family dinner the way Alaric's eyes followed his wife from the room, and had gone home that night and begun, quite calmly, to plan her destruction. There had been nothing hot in it. Gervais did very little that was hot. He had simply seen an obstacle between himself and the thing he was owed, and set about removing it, as he would have drained a wet field or put down a lame horse. He had told himself a story across the years that made all of it not only bearable but just, and he believed it entirely. And had been born too few years and too little blood to the wrong side of a great inheritance, and had been made to spend his whole life a pleasant guest in houses that should, by every right of merit, have been his own. He had smiled at 1,000 dinners below a cousin he privately despised. He had borrowed and flattered and waited and calculated and kept his warm face on through all of it, and the world had called him charming and given him nothing, while the cold cousin was handed everything and valued none of it. When at last a way had opened to set the account right, Gervais had not felt himself to be doing a wicked thing. He had felt himself to be, after long injustice, simply collecting. That was the whole secret of him, and it was why he had never lost a night's sleep, and it was why he was more dangerous by far than any hot and honest villain, for a man who believes himself owed will do, patiently and with a clear conscience, things a mere brute could never bring himself to. He had moreover no fear at all of being suspected, for who suspects the pleasant cousin, the family friend, the man everyone finds so agreeable? His whole life of smiling had been, though he had never planned it so, the perfect preparation for this one work, and he wore it now like armor. It had gone beautifully. The letters, the grief, the cold parting, the vanishing. He had come the next day and pressed his cousin's hand and watched, with a warm and sorrowful face and a heart like a cold, clean coin, the ruin he had made, and told himself it was finished, that the woman was gone for good, and the marriage past mending, and the succession safe again in his own 2 hands. He had let himself grow easy. That had been his single error, and he was too able a man not to see it the moment the news reached him. The news reached him in the late spring by a road he had himself long ago paved. Gervais, who left nothing to chance, had set a man to watch the county town after the Duchess fled, simply to be sure she stayed fled. The man was a patient and unremarkable person who sat in taprooms and listened, and in the fullness of the season he sent his master a small, unremarkable report, and in it, among the chaff, was a thing that stopped Gervais Stern's cold heart for the length of a breath: a young widow. Come out to the fens some months back, about the time of the great thaw, named Selby, keeping close at a cottage past Netherby with an old woman, said to be grieving a dead husband, said to be near her time. Gervais read it twice, as another had read a very different letter some months before, and did the arithmetic that any man could do, and understood all in a moment that he had not won at all, that he had, in fact, very nearly lost everything, that the obstacle he thought he had drained away had carried the flood off with it. 4 counties distant, ripening quietly into the one thing that would undo him past all repair. A child of Alaric's body, an heir, perhaps a son, growing, hidden, safe, in a fen cottage under a false and widow's name, waiting to be born into a world that would in time hand it everything Gervais Stern had spent his life reaching for. He did not rage. He never raged. He sat a long while in his handsome rented rooms, with the report in his hand and the pleasant smile quite gone from his face, and he thought, with the cold thoroughness that was the truest thing about him, about what must now be done, and how quietly. A widow near her time, alone in a remote place, with only an old woman by her. Such women were lost every day, in childbed, in fever, in the 100 quiet dangers that took the poor and left no question after. No one inquired closely into the death of a friendless widow at the edge of a fen. There would be grief if the thing were even heard of at Caldmere, and grief was easily borne when it cleared one's path. He would go himself. He trusted no other hand with a thing so delicate, and besides, he wished, in a way he did not examine, to see for himself the face of the woman who had so nearly beaten him. He made his preparations with care, as he made everything. He put it about that he was going north to look at some horses. He took only one servant, a hard, silent man who had done him quiet services before, and asked no questions. He was in no wild hurry, for the report said she was near her time and not yet at it, and a man who moves without hurry draws no eye. He would arrive, he judged, in his own good time, a pleasant gentleman passing through, and he would find the cottage, and he would see how the land lay, and he would do the necessary thing in the way that made least noise, and he would be home again with his horses bought and his succession clean before ever the Duke of Caldmere, blundering about the roads of England after a vanished wife, came within 100 miles of the truth. He set out in the last week before her time, smiling once more, southeast, toward the fens, and the distance between the two men who were now both hunting the same woman began, hour by hour, to close. The Duke of Caldmere found the thread to her, 4 days after his cousin had already taken hold of it, and he found it in the same place, though he did not know that, and by nearly the same road. His search had been wide and patient, and had turned up nothing, for a public coach and a common name leave nothing, and he had begun to despair of it, when Ansel, working the thing from the London end as a lawyer works, thought to ask, not where a duchess had gone, but where a friendless woman would go. A woman who flees, the old man said, flees to the one soul who loved her before she was great, for that is the one door she is sure of, who loved the duchess before she was the duchess. They went at it from that side quietly, through the records of the small Hertfordshire parish where Emmeline Selby had been a motherless girl in a quiet gentleman's house, and they found in time an old servant of that vanished household who remembered the child, and remembered above all the nurse who had raised her, a good hard fenland woman. Dorcas by name, gone home years since to her own country in the east, out past Netherby, at the grey edge of the fens. It was the thinnest of threads, an old servant's memory of a nurse's, home country and no more, and in another season Alaric would have thought it far too thin to ride 4 counties upon. He did not think so now. He had learned the price of waiting for certainty. He had waited for certainty once, over a bundle of letters, and had used the waiting as a coward uses everything, to put off the thing he feared. And it had cost him his wife, and driven her into the dark. He would not wait again. A thin thread that might lead to her was worth more than a stout one that led nowhere. Alaric was in the saddle, within the hour. He rode as he had never, this careful, life-ridden, changing horses and not himself, sleeping in snatches and wayside chairs and rising before the light. He was driven now by a thing closer to prayer than to hope, for in the hours of that hard riding, a new fear had come to him that he could not put down. If Peel had talked to him, Peel might talk to another. If he himself had reasoned his way at last to a nurse in the fens, then Gervais, who was cleverer than he by half and had never in his life been slowed by a scruple, might have reasoned it sooner. He did not know that his cousin knew of any nurse. He did know, with the cold certainty of a man who has finally understood the person he is dealing with, exactly what his cousin would do with such knowledge if he had it. And so he rode, and the county rolled by, wet and green and endless under him, and he bargained with a heaven he had never troubled before, and he did not stop. He understood, in the hours of that hard riding, a thing that would stay with him all his life. The wound his father had left in him, the cold lesson that love betrays, had not been merely his own private sorrow. It had been a door standing open in him for 30 years, and Gervais had simply walked through it. His cousin had not needed to invent a single new cruelty. He had needed only to know Alaric, to know the exact shape of the old hurt, and to hand him a lie cut precisely to fit it, and to trust him to do the rest himself. That was the fused and doubled horror of it. The thing that had ruined Emmeline was not Gervais's wickedness alone. It was Gervais's wickedness laid into the groove of Alaric's own oldest weakness, the two fitting together like a key turning in a lock, and the man who had turned that key at the last, the man who had actually put his wife out into the winter, had been no one on this earth but himself. It was on the last day, at a change of horses within 20 miles of Netherby, that the two threads of the story touched at last, and Alaric learned the thing that turned his hard ride into a headlong one. He was standing in the inn yard while they brought a fresh horse, and he heard the ostler and a carrier grumbling over their pipes about the quality passing through of late. First one fine gentleman gone down toward the fens with a hard-faced man behind him, asking soft questions about a young widow out Netherby way, and now another. Near killing horses on the same road. Alaric turned round very slowly. He made the ostler describe the first gentleman. Tall, easy, pleasant-spoken, a way of smiling, 2 days ahead upon the road, or near it, and asking after a widow named Selby. He knew then that he was too late, or very nearly, and that everything, the whole of what was left of his life, hung upon the word very. He was in the saddle again before the man had finished speaking. He left every careful thing he had ever been lying in the mud of that inn-yard, and rode the last 20 miles like a madman or a boy. And the thing that went before him the whole way, filling him, was not the letters, and not his guilt, and not even his wife's dear face, but a knowledge that had come to him whole in the inn-yard, and would not now leave him. Gervais was asking after a widow near her time. Gervais would not stir himself, would not cross a county, would not soil his hands, for a wife merely fled. There was only one thing on this earth that would bring Gervais Stern down into the fens, in person with a hard man at his back, and cold purpose behind his soft questions, and it was the same thing that had all this while been the true stake of the whole game, and that Alaric, fool and blind and drowning in his own wound, had never once let himself imagine. He had not imagined it because to imagine it, in the months of his guilt, would have been more than he could carry, and so his mind had walled it off along with everything else. Now the wall was down and the thought stood naked in the full light, and he wondered how, in the name of heaven, he had failed to see it. He had let himself believe a woman would vanish so wholly and so far, and spend her last strength on being unfindable, for the sake of mere wounded pride. Pride does not run so hard nor hide so deep. Only one thing. She had not been guarding herself. She had been guarding a life, and it was his, and he had put them both out into the winter, with his own 2 hands, and gone on believing himself the injured party. There was a child. She had gone away carrying his child. She had knelt in his cold heart's one warm corner and taken the key, and gone away into the winter, carrying the one thing he had wanted past speaking his whole starved life, and she had told him nothing, because he had given her, at the last, every reason on earth to tell him nothing. He understood it all in the space of a mile, the whole shape and weight and terrible symmetry of it, and something happened in him then that had not happened since he was 9 years old in a cold house. The wall came down. Not in words, for there was no one to speak to but a laboring horse and a low gray sky, but wholly and for good, the whole cold architecture of a lifetime falling at once, and behind it was not the weakness his father had promised him, but a strength he had never been let near. The plain, enormous strength of a man who is finally something he will die before he loses. He bent low over the horse's neck. He asked it for everything. Netherby lay ahead in the failing light, a low smudge at the edge of the water, and somewhere in it were the two people who were the whole of his life. And somewhere in it, ahead of him still, was the pleasant, smiling man who had come to take them from the world. Gervais had found the cottage that same afternoon and had been, as he was in all things, unhurried and pleasant and thorough. He had not gone to the door. He was too able for that. He had taken a room instead at the mean little inn that served the last of the fen villages, a passing gentleman whose horse had cast a shoe, and he had spent the gray hours learning the ground the way he learned everything, by listening. He learned which cottage, and that the old woman Dorcas walked to the far farm each evening at dusk for the milk, and was gone the better part of an hour, and that in that hour the young widow, being now very near her time and heavy and slow, was alone, with the nearest other soul 2 fields off. It was, he reflected over his ale, almost too easy. But the fen conspired at their remoteness, and there was nothing in it but what there seemed. A woman alone at dusk in a lonely house at the edge of nowhere. He finished his ale. He told the hard, silent man to have the horses ready at the dark of the evening, for they would not be staying the night. Then he walked out, unhurried, pleasant, into the falling light, toward the cottage at the lane's end where the reeds began. Emmeline knew him the instant she opened the door, and her blood went to water. She had opened it thinking it was Dorcas come back early, and instead there was Gervais stern on the step with the last light behind him, and his warm, familiar smile on his face, and under the smile she saw, quite plainly, as she had once or twice half seen it across a crowded room, the thing that lived behind it. He looked, without haste and without shame, at the great curve of her, at how near her time she plainly was, and she watched him do the arithmetic she had crossed a country to keep him from ever doing, and watched the last of the pleasantness leave his eyes while the smile stayed on his mouth, and she understood that she and her child were at that moment closer to death than she had ever been in her life. She did not scream. There was no one to hear it but the man who had come to silence her. She did not faint, though the room swam. She did the one thing that was left to a heavy, slow-cornered woman with a quick and desperate mind, which was to talk, and to move, and to keep the width of the deal table between them while she did. She said his name pleasantly, as though glad of it. She said what a very great way he had come, and would he not sit, and she turned as if to set the kettle to the fire, and put the table's length behind her, and took up, in the same motion, low and unhurried so that he should not see, the short, heavy fen knife that Dorcas used for the reeds, and that lay always by the hearth. She did not think she could best him. She thought only that she would not go quiet, that she would mark him, so that whatever was found hereafter would carry the plain marks of a fight, and could never be smiled away as fever or childbed. If she could do nothing else for her child, she would at least make any harm done to it impossible to hide. She set her back to the wall by the fire, and she faced him with the small knife low at her side, and she said in a voice that hardly shook at all, "You had far better go, Gervais. I have written it all down, every word of it, where the letters were made, and by whom and why. It is lodged in a safe place with a safe hand, to be opened if I am not living to stop it. You cannot make me quiet by making me dead. You will only hang for it." It was a lie, and a good one, and for a moment in the failing light she thought it might even serve, for she saw him weigh it, saw the cold, clever mind go over it for the flaw, and she held his eyes, and did not let her face betray that there was no such paper anywhere in the world. Then he smiled again, the true smile, now the one that reached nothing, and she knew he had found the flaw, which was that a woman who had truly lodged such a paper would have used it long since to save her marriage, and that her having run and hidden instead proved she had no weapon but her wits. "No, I think not," he said gently, almost kindly, and took a step around the table toward her, and the last light showed her that his hand was not empty either. "You are a brave and a clever woman, cousin, and I am sorry for it. I want you to know I take no pleasure in this. It is only that you are standing where I am owed to stand, you and the thing you carry, and I have waited a very long while." And it was at that moment, with the heavy man's tread now sounding at the door behind him, and no help anywhere in the wide gray world, that the world all the same tore open, for the door was flung back on its hinges hard enough to crack the plaster, and Alaric was in the room. What followed was very quick, and would afterward never come to Emmeline whole, only in pieces, as such moments do. The Duke of Caldmere, crossing the little room, not like a duke, but like a falling wall. The hard, silent servant meeting him and being flung aside into the crockery as though he weighed nothing, for there is no hired strength on earth that stands against a man with everything to lose. Gervais turning, the smile gone at last and wholly, the pleasant mask torn clean off to show the frightened, greedy child beneath it that had been there the whole while. A short and ugly struggle by the hearth, no grace in it and no ceremony. Two men of the same blood grappling in a poor room in the firelight over the life of a woman and a child. And Alaric's voice, which no one in that county had heard raised in 10 cold years, filling the small space like a broken dam, saying her name, saying it over and over, Emmeline, Emmeline, as though it were the only word he had left in the world and he meant to make up in one night for a lifetime of silence. It ended with Gervais on the floor, and Alaric standing over him with a face Emmeline had never seen, and the hard man groaning in the broken crockery, and Dorcas in the doorway with the milk spilled white across the step, and a farmhand and his 2 grown sons behind her, armed with what came to hand, for the old woman had seen the fine gentleman on the road at dusk, and known in her deep fen bones what he meant, and had not gone for milk at all, but for men. It was over. The cold, clever plan of a lifetime lay on a cottage floor, in the reek of spilled milk and broken delft, held down by the plain hands of fen laborers, undone at the last not by cleverness at all, but by an old woman's love and a young one's courage, and a cold man who had learned, 4 counties in a lifetime too late, how to come running. Alaric turned from his cousin and looked at his wife, across the little room, across the whole ruin of everything, and she was standing against the wall with a reed knife in her hand, and her chin up, and her eyes blazing, and the great fullness of his child before her. Alive, alive, and neither of them for a moment could speak at all. They took Gervais Stern away that night, bound in the back of his own hired trap, to be given up to the law of the county, and the hard silent servant with him, while Dorcas swept up the broken crockery and scolded, weeping, everyone within reach, which was her way of praising heaven that they were living. But that came a little after. First there was the thing that had to happen in the small, stunned quiet, when the room had cleared and it was only the 2 of them at last, across a space no wider than a poor room and as wide as a whole winter. Alaric did not cross it at once. He had learned, on the long road, a great deal about what he had no right to. And he stood where he was, filthy and shaking and undone, and he did the hardest thing he had ever done, which was to speak first and to speak plainly, he to whom plain speech had been for 30 years a kind of death. "I know it was Gervais," he said. "I know he made the letters. I have known you were innocent since the 3rd night. And I let my pride sit on the knowing, and I will be ashamed of that until I die. I did not come to ask you to forgive it. It cannot be forgiven, and I do not ask it." His voice was rough and low, and it did not once look away from her. "I came because a man who has done what I have done must at least stand in front of the person he has wronged, and let her see him, and say to her that he was wrong, wholly wrong, the one thing that mattered in his life, and that he knows it. That is all I came to do. Whatever you tell me to do now, I will do. If you tell me to go, I will go, and you will never see me again. And I will see that you and the child want for nothing to the end of your days, and are never troubled by any soul of my blood so long as I live. You have only to say it." And Emmeline, who had rehearsed for the better part of a year all the cold, hard things she would say to this man if ever the fen gave him back to her, found that she could not say one of them. She looked at him standing there, at the ruin of the proud, cold Duke of Caldmere in her nurse's poor doorway, at the grey eyes that for the first time in the whole of their marriage hid nothing at all, and she understood that the wall was truly down, that the man she had glimpsed only in a walled garden in the early mornings was standing now wholly in the open where anyone might wound him, and that he had made himself so on purpose for her at the one moment it could cost him everything. It was the thing she had wanted from him and despaired of, and left him rather than live without. He had brought it to her 4 counties across England, too late and only just in time. She thought, in the long moment while he waited on her word, of everything it had cost her to build the small free life he had come to overturn, and of how she had sworn 100 nights by this fire that if the fen ever gave him back, she would send him away and keep her hard-won peace. She was free now, truly free, in a way she had not been on the night he broke her. She had a trade in her 2 hands and a roof of her own arranging, and a child that was hers before ever it was his. And she could send this man out into the dark and never want for bread. And she knew it, and he knew it, and that was the very thing that made her choice a clean one at last. She was not choosing him out of fear, as she had once married partly out of the wish to be safe. She was not choosing him out of need, for she needed nothing of his. If she chose him now, it could only be for the one reason that was worth anything, which was that she wished to, and she found, looking at the broken open man in the doorway, that against all her long sworn sense, she did. She did not answer him in words. She found, no more use for words than he had ever had. She crossed the little room herself, heavy and slow and certain, and she took his cold shaking hand in both of hers, as she had not been let to do on the last night at Caldmere, and she laid it flat against the great curve of herself, against the hard living roundness of the child, and she held it there, as though it knew, as though it had only been waiting for its cue, turned and kicked strong and sure against his palm. She would remember his face at that moment for the rest of her long life. She had given him back, in one motion, and without a syllable, every truth at once, that she was with child, that the child was his, that she had carried it away in silence, and meant him never to know, and had now of her own free will, with her own 2 hands, undone all of that, and laid the whole of it in his keeping. The proud man made a sound she had never heard from him, or from any man, and went down slowly to his knees on the poor stone floor, with his hands still spread against his child, and he wept. The cold, silent Duke of Caldmere wept as she had wept by this same fire in the winter, terribly and without any art, while she stood over him and held his dark head against her, and looked into the little living fire and out beyond the door at the last of the light dying over the wide flat water, and knew that the winter, the whole long white winter of her life, was over at last. The child, a son, was born 11 days later in the cottage at Netherby, with the fen midwife at hand this time, and Dorcas by the fire and the child's father, against every custom and every counsel, refusing wholly to leave the house, sitting the whole of that long night on the stairs with his head in his hands and being, everyone agreed after, buff, no earthly use whatever, which is the proper condition of a man at such a time. Toward dawn they let him in. He took the small, furious red creature into his 2 hands, as though it were the whole of the world's meaning made suddenly and alarmingly light enough to hold, and he looked at it a long while and said nothing, for what was there in the language to say? And Emmeline, watching from the bed, or saw him become in that moment the thing he had wanted since he was a cold and frightened boy, and never dared to hope he might be, which was a father who would not, whatever else befell, ever once leave. The reckoning with the world came after, and it was done, at Alaric's plain insistence, wholly in the open. He would have no more of secrets. He had lived 30 years inside one, and it had nearly cost him everything, and he was finished with them for good. So when they were strong enough to travel, he took his wife and his son home to Caldmere, openly, in the ducal carriage, with the arms upon the door, and he set about the slow public labor of giving Emmeline back the thing that had been taken from her, which was her good name before the world. The proof of the forgery was laid before the law and the county both. Without one particle held back, the engraver Peel told his tale to those who needed to hear it. The whole architecture of Gervase Stern's long, patient wickedness was taken down stone by stone in the full light of day, and the county, which had whispered so eagerly about the Duchess who fled her marriage, was made to understand exactly whom it ought to have whispered about, and had the grace most of it to be ashamed. Gervase did not hang in the end, for Alaric found he had no wish to take even that life, blood being blood. But he was broken past mending, stripped of his expectations and his place and his pleasant name, and put out to a poor and watched existence very far away. And the doors of that county closed behind him, one by one, exactly as he had once meant a fen cottage to close over a woman and a child, and there was a justice in it that Emmeline could look at without triumph and without pity, which is the only kind worth having. As for Emmeline, the doors that had shut so eagerly against the fleeing Duchess opened again just as eagerly to the wronged and vindicated one, and she walked back through them on her husband's arm, with her son in her keeping, and found that she cared for them almost not at all. She had learned in a fen cottage exactly what such doors were worth, and could not any longer be greatly moved by the opening or the shutting of them. She was civil to the county. She forgave where forgiveness was honestly asked, more readily than her husband thought wise, and more slowly than her own soft heart first wished, which is about the right pace for it. But the good opinion of the drawing-rooms, which had once been the very air she breathed, had become to her a small and outside thing, and she kept her true regard for the people who had earned it in the dark. For an old fen woman who had opened a door on a winter night and asked no questions for a village that had given a friendless widow rough kindness and a wide berth. For those she would have opened any door she owned at any hour, and did to the end of her life. And the Duke of Caldmere, who had been the coldest and most silent man in 3 counties, became by slow and clumsy degrees another thing, and did it in the open, where all could see, and did not care that they saw. He learned to speak. He was never a fluent man, and never would be, and the county came in time to prize his few rough sentences above another man's chatter, in the way of the world, which values a warm thing most once it has watched a man nearly lose it forever. But it was not in the great rooms that the change in him was truest. It was in a walled garden, on the cold, bright mornings of the spring that followed, when the frost was breaking and the hidden life was pricking up green through the black beds once again, and a hard, gray-eyed man could be found kneeling in the good earth with his sleeves turned back and his small son beside him in the dirt, teaching the child, without very many words, for he had never needed many there, how to set a root so that it would take. He spoke, in the good years that followed, more than he had spoken in the whole of his life before, though never a great deal, and never easily, and always with the faint roughness of a man using a thing long left to rust. But he said the things that mattered to the one it mattered to, when it mattered, which is the whole of what speech is for, and more than most men manage with all their fluency. He told his son that he loved him plainly, in words more times, in that child's first year, than his own father had told him in a lifetime, which was never once. He told his wife the same, at the gray hour in the garden, with the dirt upon his hands. He had 30 silent years to make up, he said to her once, and did not expect to finish them, and she said she was in no hurry, and that she had grown, in the fen, unexpectedly fond of a companionable silence herself, and would want a share of those kept among the words. And so they kept both, the words and the silences, each in its proper season, Emmeline hung one thing only, on the wall of that garden's little house, framed and glazed against the weather, where she could see it when she worked. It was a small and rusted iron key. It fit no lock any longer, for Alaric had long since had the garden door set open for good, and its lock taken off, so that the one place he had ever hidden should never be a place that shut again. But she kept the key, and framed it, and no visitor who did not know the story could ever be made to see why a duchess should so honor a worthless bit of iron. Emmeline knew why. Once, in the coldest winter of her life, a silent man had let one door in himself stand open to her, and she had carried the key to it away into the dark, alone, believing it the only warm thing she would ever have of him. She had been wrong as he had been wrong, as the whole cold winter of their lives had been one long wrong that the spring had at the last put right. The frost had lied. Under all that white silence, the living thing had been there the whole time, only waiting, and it had come up at last into the open air and the light, and it had flowered, and it went on flowering year upon year, in a garden with no lock upon its door.